Wow. I'm going to go ahead and give a brief introduction, go over some housekeeping. So if anybody's using our Wordly translation software, you can go into the top upper left-hand corner of your screen, you hit live, and then that should open up a new window for the Wordly translation in the top right-hand corner. You can hit your language of choice and you will see closed captioning in your language. A few brief disclaimers. The sessions here are set up for information and educational purposes only. So if you have any questions specifically related to you or your child, please consult your physician. Zoom is not a HIPAA compliant platform. So again, in the questions, please leave all patient identifiers out, including name and date of birth. And then the session is being recorded. It will be housed in the platform for later use. And might be made available on our website at a later date as well. So if anybody has any questions, you can go ahead and ask them in the chat. In this session, we will also allow participants to ask questions via voice. So you can use the raise hand feature. And if you raise your hand, we can turn on your microphone and you can ask them live. If you're having trouble with that, then you can go ahead and ask them in the Q&A. And Dr. Squires has some very intense moderators who are going to join us. Cedar is going to be one of them. So good luck, Dr. Squires, and I am going to hand it over to you.
What is that anyway?
Okay. Well, Emily, thank you so much. And for all those attending, thank you. For all those who watch this later, thank you. Again, as Emily mentioned, my name is Jim Squires. I'm one of the hepatologists in Pittsburgh who cares for many children with PFIC. So, I was asked to give a talk on PFIC for kids, kind of aimed towards the younger population. And so recognizing there's a wide range of what it means to be a kid from 5 through 18, depending on how you want to define it. I went to the liberty of trying to put together some slides that kind of goes through PFIC at a very bare bones level, but also recognize that I want to spend maybe the majority of our time together answering questions from those kids who may have a question that they've never asked their doctor, or that they've always wanted to ask, but they always felt they couldn't ask, or from a parent who feels the same way. So I'll do my best to kind of go through what I think PFIC means for those patients that we take care of. So I have some slides here. I'm going to share. Let's see here. I'm going to share this. All right. And I think. Emily, do you guys see the full slide set?
We see it.
Okay, perfect. All right. So again, Jim Squires from Pittsburgh, and the title that I was told to talk about is, well, what is PFIC? Well, we'll talk about it. So what's our plan? What's the outline? How are we going to do this, right? So we're going to first talk about what is the liver, right? Because I think understanding what a liver is helps a little bit understand what PFIC may be. Then we're going to move on to what is PFIC, and then I just want to briefly talk about how we treat it, and go over some of the ways in which we think treatments may benefit kids with PFIC. So what's the liver? This is a liver. This is a picture of your liver. It is a soft, solid organ. It is located right here in what we call the right upper quadrant of your belly. There's a lot of cool things. I'm not biased in any way, but I think the liver is the most important organ in our body. And it's got some really cool, interesting facts that I think a lot of people might not know, right? So first of all, is that it's mostly water, right? 96% of your liver is water. It's the largest organ in our body, if you didn't know that. I have a little asterisk there because technically there's an organ that's bigger than our liver, but it's the skin. It's outside, right? So if you're thinking about what's inside the organ and internal organs, which is how we often think about organs, the liver is the largest. It's really unique in that it can regenerate. Most of our organs, like your brain and your heart and your kidneys, they can't really grow back or regenerate. If there's injury to those organs, that injury is kind of, you're only left with whatever tissue's left. You can't regrow it. But the liver, that can regenerate. So, when we talk about liver in the medical field, we use words like hepato or hepatic. And those are fancy words from Latin that mean liver. So when you hear us talk about hepatology or hepatitis or, hepa this, hepa that, we are referring to the liver and liver-related things. And I think, maybe most importantly below here, the liver doesn't just do one thing, right? Unlike the heart, right, which is just a boring pump, the liver has many different functions. And so this is kind of like a simple Google search picture if you type liver function to kind of talk about what the liver actually does. And so you can kind of start at the top right-hand side and go all the way around. But one of the things it does is it prevents shortages of nutrients by storing vitamins and minerals. And so when we eat food and drink stuff, it ends up going to the liver where we store it for later, so that if we go through a period where we have to miss dinner or we skip lunch, the liver is able to kind of break down some of that storage material and keep our bodies going. It produces most of the proteins we need. And now, again, proteins are special, small biological pieces that make up most of our body, and it makes most of those proteins. It produces bile, and we're going to come back to this, right, about what bile is and why bile is important. One of the things that bile does is it helps us absorb fats and certain vitamins such as A, D, E, and K. It produces most of the substances that we use to clot blood, right? So if we get a cut or we fall down or we get a bruise and we have some bleeding, the good news is our body knows that bleeding eventually stops itself, and then we kind of form a scab. And the way in which blood is able to stop itself is by making proteins in the liver that helps us with blood clotting. It actually helps us fight infection. So one of the things people don't realize that the liver does is act as an immune organ to make cells and to provide an environment for fighting infection. It also metabolizes and breaks down foods, right? So again, we talked about how food that we eat gets absorbed through our intestine. It then goes to the liver and is processed even further so that it can either be used right away, stored for later, or even kind of getting rid of certain substances that we don't need. And that kind of leads to the top box, where it removes potential toxic byproducts, right? So it also acts in a little bit as kind of a wastewater treatment plant to filter out those things the body doesn't need and has a mechanism to get rid of it. But again, for the purposes of PFIC, we kind of focus on this unique function of the liver, which is to produce bile, because it is the parts of bile that can lead to problems in PFIC. And so we're going to talk about that in our next segment, which is, what is PFIC? Well, first, when you think about PFIC, PFIC is an acronym, meaning each of those letters stands for a particular thing, right? And so the P stands for progressive, right? F stands for familial. I stands for intrahepatic. There's that hepatic word again. And then C stands for cholestasis. But these, these four words in and of themselves are kind of can be complicated. So we'll break it down any further.
Excuse me, Dr. Squires.
Oh, yeah.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hey, sorry to interrupt you. I wanted to let you know your screen is a little bit zoomed in. Would you mind zooming it out a little so we can see your slide, please?
Yeah. How do I do that? Oh my gosh.
Oh, that's perfect. You've done it.
I've done something.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Well, whatever I did, happy to have helped. So again, we're kind of walking through PFIC and what it means, right? So we got to the word progressive, right? So what does it mean to be progressive? Well, in medicine, we means that whatever's happening is happening gradually or developing slowly. And so progressive is how we describe that. When we say familial, what we mean is that it occurs in family members, and it occurs in family members because family members share genes, right? But what are genes? Well, genes are the genetic code, or the DNA, probably most of us have heard of DNA, that we get from our parents. And when we have DNA, the DNA that is in our cells undergoes a process called transcription, where it makes this fancy molecule called mRNA. mRNA has been in the news a lot because this is the material that we've used to make a bunch of the COVID vaccines. But the mRNA that's transcribed from our DNA is then used by the body to make proteins. We already talked a little bit about what proteins are, but it makes all the different proteins in our body. And proteins are important because depending on which protein we're talking about, this is where we get the different types of PFIC. I think, depending on who's in the audience, I think we recognize that there are a number of different types of PFIC that can also, they can sometimes be grouped together under the umbrella term of PFIC, but these are actually very different, sometimes diseases that are due to defects in a particular protein. And so again, intrahepatic, this means it occurs inside the liver. And then cholestasis. So when we talk about cholestasis in medicine, what we're talking about is a problem with the formation, excretion, or flow of bile. Bile, that substance being that we touched upon before that helps us absorb fats and certain other things. So what is bile, right? And why is bile so important? So bile itself is actually the liquid that our liver makes that gets excreted into our gallbladder and then into our intestines. Bile is made of many different things. I think if you look at the bottom, the composition of bile is bile salts, phospholipids, or kind of breakdown products that we don't need, cholesterol. This is how we get rid of cholesterol in our body. And then bile pigments, or bilirubin, which is actually a breakdown product of our red blood cells. And what we use bile for is, again, to help with things like digestion, to help with things like absorption of fats, and to help with excretion of some of that nasty byproduct stuff that we don't need that gets absorbed from things that we eat from our intestine. But in PFIC, it is the bile salts that we focus in on, because it is the bile salts that sometimes can cause a lot of the problems. And bile salts, again, their particular function, right, is to help us absorb fats and fat-soluble substances. And so, again, why is this important? Why do we need it? And why does, when it goes wrong, is it an issue? Well, let's think about different ways in which we consume fats, right? So you can have a cone of ice cream, you can drink a cup of milk, you can eat a big fatty steak, and all of these things have fat in it, right? And if you look at fat under a microscope, it kind of looks like this. It's kind of got a bunch of globules, and it's made up of different kind of pieces that kind of congeal together to form what is fat. Now, the issue with fat, I think we've all probably done that experiment in high school, where if you have, oil, which is a fat, right? You take a cup of olive oil and you put it in to a glass of water, it separates out and the oil kind of floats to the top and the water sits on the bottom, because fat and water don't mix very well. But as we noted, right, the liver itself is 96% water, and the liver is not unique in that. Most of our body is liquid water. You've probably heard that fun fact before. And so in order to absorb fats into our bodies, which are mostly water, we need to break it down into really, really, really tiny pieces. And this is where the liver comes in. And this is where the liver makes those bile salts, right, which is this little yellow guy here, to help us with this process. Because what bile salts then do is they kind of intermix among these big pieces of fat, and they kind of what we call emulsify the fat, or break it down into really itty bitty tiny little fat droplets that we can then absorb across our intestines, which are mostly water. And so this is why bile salts are so important. If we didn't have bile salts, all of the nutrition and good things that come from the stuff that we eat, we wouldn't be able to absorb very well. And so the problem with PFIC is a secretion of bile salts. This is where one of the main problems and what causes a lot of the symptoms. But why? Why is this a problem? This is a problem because every cell in our body is covered by what we call a cell membrane. And a cell membrane has two different parts of it. One of which is these little circles, which are actually tiny little fat droplets. And the other are these little pieces on the inside, which are kind of more water-like substances. And so if we have a bile salt, which, as we just talked about, whose job of a bile salt is to break down fats into tiny pieces. If we have a bile salt close to or inside a cell that is unprotected, that bile salt is going to break down the cell membrane because that's its job. And so this is kind of a picture of the different PFICs, or at least PFIC 1 through 5 or 1 through 6, and why this is kind of a problem. And I can come back to this picture because I know it's kind of busy. But these little green dots, these are your bile salts, or bile acids, they're sometimes called. And so it's this little guy that if we don't protect against, he can disrupt cell membranes and lead to cell damage. All these different proteins, FIC1, this is the protein that is affected in those who have PFIC1. BSEP is the protein that's affected in PFIC2. MDR3 is PFIC3. TJP2 is PFIC 4. This FXR over here is PFIC 5, and this Myo5B is PFIC 6. And then, as many of us know, there are others. But all of these different proteins have a role in making sure that as the liver is making bile acids, that they are made and get out of the liver without doing damage to the liver cell. And so if you have a defect in one of these proteins, pick which protein, doesn't matter, you can have a problem protecting the cell against this bile salt. And so that's where you get the injury inside the liver in PFIC. So how is it treated? So unfortunately, we don't have great treatment options, as I'm sure many on this call know. Oftentimes we support families and kids where we can. So any complications of their PFIC, whether it's having been on special formulas that allow them to absorb fats, or monitoring for complications of their progressive disease, we support them where we can. We look to optimize their nutrition. So there are certain diets and parts of a diet that we will sometimes put kids on in order to make sure that they are as healthy as possible despite their PFIC. As many of you know, itching is one of the terrible complications of PFIC. And so there are medicines that we will try to treat itch and support the itch where we can. As the name implies, progressive means that these things progress over time. And so it's one of our jobs to monitor for complications that can develop in diseases that progress. And I think most importantly is recognizing that there are old medicines and new medicines that we are continuing to try to study and understand how they can potentially help treat kids and adults who have PFIC disorders. But what happens when none of this works, right? I think in many instances, despite all of our best efforts, we aren't able to really control well the underlying progressive nature of the disease. Well, that's sometimes then when we call our surgical friends. And our surgeons have a couple things that they'll try, right? There's the biliary diversion. And if you've ever heard or talked or wondered what a biliary diversion is, these are the pictures. There's a couple different ways that we do it. But because we think that it's the bile that sometimes causes the problem, if we can get the bile outside the body without being absorbed in the intestine, we have found that sometimes can help certain people. And so there's the external diversion in A, where they actually take a little piece of your intestine and sew it to your gallbladder, which is where bile is stored, and then bring it to the outside of your body. And we put a bag on this. And so bile kind of flows outside of the body that way. There's something called an internal diversion. We didn't get into this too much, but this last part of the small intestine here, this is where bile gets kind of reabsorbed into the body to kind of keep it into the body as much as possible. And so if you bypass this little part of the intestine, the bile will just kind of go out of your large intestine and you poop it out. And so if you do an internal diversion, you can divert bile past the part of the intestine where it gets reabsorbed. And so that's another way. And then this is what we call an ileal exclusion. Ileum being, again, this very special part of the intestine that bile acids are reabsorbed in. If you bypass that, then bile doesn't get reabsorbed and you poop it out there too. So there's a couple different ways that people sometimes will think to get rid of bile. And when none of this works, we do liver transplants. And again, some on this call, including my moderator, who I'm trying to slow down my talking so she has less time to grill me, has had liver transplants for their underlying disorder. And so when all else fails and when all our other interventions don't work, we do offer liver transplants sometimes for this disorder. And so, that is kind of the kind of brief introduction to PFIC. So hopefully, we've finished up by understanding what a liver is and why it's important, why it's cool, and why people like me study it. Hopefully you get a little bit better understanding of what PFIC is, why bile acids have a role in PFIC and why we look to treat them in that sense. And again, hopefully we finished up with, as it currently stands, our treatment options. But I'm happy to go through any one or more of these topics on a much more detailed, granular level as folks desire for the next 20 or 30 minutes or so. So I'm going to stop now. Again, I kind of wanted to go quickly just to kind of, get through the talk, but I really wanted and look forward to the discussion part and welcome any questions that folks may have. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to go back to the picture. I see Cedar ready with questions. I see we got a couple in the chat already. So, all right, Cedar, what do you got for me? Let's do it.
All right.
So I have two questions.
Oh, okay.
This one is what happens when, well, basically they do a liver transplant.
Oh, so I think, again, Steve's question is what happens when they do a liver transplant? Well, one of the things we know about PFIC is that protein, I should say in most PFICs, that protein that is defective is inside the liver. It's all in your liver. And so when the liver gets injured to the point where it's not working very well, again, all those 200 functions we talked about, if the liver isn't able to do those functions very well, we have complications. And when they do a liver transplant, they essentially will go in and take out the liver. And they will kind of tie off, the blood that's coming into the liver and the blood that's exiting the liver. They take out your organ and they put a new one in, tie the vessels that feed the liver back together, tie the vessels that empty the liver back together, and then you have a new liver. I think one of the great things about liver and liver transplant is that as opposed to many other organs, the liver tolerates that really well. Some other organs, it's a lot harder to perform transplants because whenever you have a liver transplant, that liver that is now inside you wasn't yours originally, right? It was somebody else's or a part of somebody else's. And so whenever you have something inside your body that isn't yours, sometimes the body fights that off with immune cells and with other kind of mechanisms that it usually is using to protect you. And so when you get a liver transplant, we often give you medicines that you have to take every day to kind of keep your immune system a little bit at bay so that it kind of accepts that new organ that's inside you. And so that's what they do. They essentially just cut out your old liver, put in a new one.
Thank you for that.
You're so welcome. What other questions we got?
All right. So moderator Cedar, you said you had 2 questions. What is your second question?
My second question was, you kind of explained this in the beginning, but just for a little farther, what is bile basically?
Yeah, no. So again, bile, it's a really complex substance, right? And it has, so it's a mixture of a lot of different things, but it's a combination of breakdown products. So, if you think about, what is bile and where does it come from? Bile is if we went back to that picture of the liver, bile is also how our liver gets rid of a lot of stuff we don't need. So part of what bile is kind of waste products of kind of things that our body has, it's done using, and so it needs to get rid of it. And so, bile is used to get rid of that. Bile has, kind of cholesterol, which are parts of fats that we take in. And then bile has these things called bile salts, which are those products that we went over that kind of helps us break down the big fat globules that we eat. And again, it's the bile salts in PFIC that end up causing the problem, because all of those different proteins that we use to make bile salts and make sure that bile salts get out of our liver and where they need to go safely, those are defective in PFIC. And so when we can't get those bile salts where they need to be in a safe way, those bile salts can injure the liver. And so that's the challenge. And this is why, again, for those on the call, why was there, it used to be just 3 PFICs, now there's 6. I was on a talk yesterday where he identified 12 potential PFICs. We learn more and more about PFICs because PFIC, there's lots of different proteins that are involved in making bile and making sure it gets out of the liver in a safe way. And the more proteins that we understand help with that process, the more chances that we can identify when one of those doesn't work very well that can cause disease. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Now, I'll give you another fun fact. So bile also contains the stuff that gives our poop its color. So if you don't have bile, or you have like a blockage of bile, your poop is like white. So yeah, I know. So people who have white poop have like a whole nother problem, right? But if you ever notice you have white poop, call your doctor, tell your parents. We'd want to know about that. But that doesn't generally happen in kids with PFIC.
Thank you for that explanation.
Sure. Trey, you got any questions? I see you down there.
Yeah, so how does a PFIC affect you?
So again, I mean, PFIC affects everybody a little bit differently. And this is one of the really big challenges that we have, because PFIC is what, like, let's say you take the color white and the color black, right? Then there's like a million different shades of gray in between those two ends of the color spectrum. And PFIC is kind of like that. There are people who have really bad PFIC, whose livers get sick very, very early and sometimes need transplant at a very young age. And there's other people who we say have PFIC, or at least have the same protein that doesn't work very well, but who may only have intermittent problems and do quite well. And so this has always been one of the challenges of trying to kind of define or give a good definition for PFIC. So when someone says, well, how does PFIC affect your liver? A lot of times that depends on the individual patient, right? Because what may be your experience with PFIC, Trey, may not have been Cedar's experience with her PFIC, even though we're saying you have the same thing, right? And so I think that everybody is a little bit different. And so we always have to try to be very careful to recognize that each kid is very unique. And although we sometimes try to say this is all the same disease, they're very different, or at least they can present very differently in individual kids.
Well, that's a really great answer, Dr. Squires. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Another question, what happens, is it possible after transplant to be itchy again?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. The one that we worry a little bit more about that in is PFIC2, because PFIC2 is unique in that PFIC2 can actually recur in a liver transplant, in someone who's had a liver transplant. The reason that happens is it's pretty complex, actually. But most other PFICs, if they've had a liver transplant, no longer itch. Their new liver is able to make bile safely, get the bile out safely, and so they don't have any problems with itching after their transplant. Sometimes there's other complications that we have to watch for, and so we never, we're always trying to balance, whether or not transplant is going to be the right intervention for an individual patient. But after transplant, unless you have PFIC2, we generally say you're not going to itch. And even if you do have PFIC2, the chances are your itch is going to be eliminated for good.
Okay. So another question. So our kiddos with PFIC, as you can see, we're pretty few in numbers. And for most of our kids, they have only ever met a few kids with PFIC, and it's been through this conference experience. So can you let us know, Dr. Squire, how many kids with PFIC have you ever met?
I have met a lot of kids with PFIC, actually. And part of that is kind of based on where I am in the country, and that I'm in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania has a group of people called the Amish and Mennonites, so sometimes people will hear PFIC1 be called Byler's disease. Anybody ever heard that term? Emily or Cedar never heard it? Trey, you ever heard Byler's disease? Not Trey either. But Byler's disease is actually named after a family whose last name was Byler. That was their last name. And the Bylers are from Pennsylvania, the middle of Pennsylvania. And this family of Bylers, they have lots of members. And so we see a lot of people who come from this small community where PFIC is a little bit more common. But you are right in that at the end of the day, PFIC is still, and you may talk to many liver doctors who've never seen a patient with PFIC, particularly somebody who may not be at a large center. So these are still what we call rare diseases. They are not common, and you guys are very, very, very unique, which we recognize also sometimes leads to some of the frustrations as a patient and as a parent. When you're trying to talk to your doctor and your doctor is like actively Googling, what is PFIC, right? Or how do I treat this? I've never heard of this. I think I read about it once in a textbook. And so that is a real experience that we recognize. And this is where you guys have done such a great job of getting the word out, right, to the community. Everything is power in numbers. So Cedar, Trey, thank you guys for lending a voice and a face to these rare diseases, because there are lots of other kids out there that kind of need you guys to help them be their voice where you can. But it is rare. I have seen a lot of kids with it. And I think part of that's uniquely for where I am, and I'm in a large institution where a lot of kids kind of get referred to. So
Yeah. Well, thank you. So guys, it's good to know that there are lots more kiddos out there just like you guys. Even if you might not cross paths with them, it's nice to know that you guys are not alone. So I think Trey has a question from our audience.
Did you have a question, Trey?
Do you see the question, Trey, from the audience?
So the question is, if you get a transplant, does it last your whole life, or will you need more?
That is a great question. And it, as with all questions, it can be complicated. We generally hope and plan that if you need a liver transplant, that transplant will last you your whole life. Now, the longer answer to that is that we still are learning about transplants, because transplants in kind of in the modern era of transplant, right, or kind of in its newest form, is really only about 20 to 25 years old. The first liver transplant was done in 1960, but liver transplants with any kind of larger numbers really didn't start until the 80s. And it really wasn't until the late 90s, early 2000s, where we had the knowledge and the medicines that allowed us to treat transplants more effectively. And we're learning more each day, right? Transplant today is different than it was 20 years ago. But when we talk to, so the answer there is, if you would ask me, what does a liver transplant look like 60 years from now? We just don't know, because, for the most part, we only really have 20 to 25 years of information that can allow us to kind of inform that answer and tell you what it means. Now, the numbers there are that about 85 to 90% of people are doing really well after their transplant that far out. But the challenge there is obviously for our kids who are 5, 10, 15 years old when they get their liver transplant. 25 years gets now they're 30. Okay, so that's not a whole life, but we just don't know, right? There are only very, very, very few people who got transplanted, in 1980 that were able to kind of understand, if that's going to be the experience of everybody or just that kind of one patient. So it's hard, but we can say that in general, 20 to 25 years out, transplants are really well. There are some times where the liver transplant doesn't do as well, and there's a variety of different reasons why that happens. And there are patients who sometimes need a second liver transplant for, again, a variety of different reasons that I'm happy to talk about. But when that happens, we can visit, and we do repeat transplants when they're needed.
Thank you, Dr. Squires. I think Cedar, you have another question?
Yeah, so I have 2 questions again. My first question is, how does certain foods affect the medicines you take?
It's a great question. So, we don't really think that certain foods affect your medicine or affect your PFIC. There are certain foods that, depending on how sick your liver is, you may not be able to tolerate very well or absorb very well. So if you have a PFIC where your liver is very sick, or that bile isn't able to flow very well, sometimes you're not able to absorb those fats that we talked about. And as much as we talk about how bad fat is for you, at the end of the day, you still need fat to do many, many different things. And so absorbing fat is a good thing. And when you can't do that, sometimes kids can not grow very well. They can be kind of on the small side. Sometimes those vitamins that we talked about, the vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin K, vitamin E, those are really important vitamins. And if we can't absorb those very well from our fat, sometimes if we get deficient in those, there can be complications from kind of low vitamin levels. But generally, if you have PFIC, unless you're a baby, that sometimes there's special formulas we may put kids on. There's no restriction that we would say that you need, and no foods that are going to make you any sicker.
Well, and then my second question was, Trey and I already have asked this, but what is the difference between PFIC 1, PFIC 2, and PFIC 3?
That's a great question. So again, the different types of PFICs are based on the protein that is defective in those disorders. And so, I think I showed that one cartoon of all the different, that kind of like the pathway, right? Because there are many, many, many different proteins whose job it is to make bile and then get it out of the liver safely, right? So I guess you could kind of think about it like, like a car, right? If you have a car that's supposed to drive down the road, there are many reasons why a car might not go down the road well, right? Like if I came and stole all the tires off your car, well, the car wouldn't work very well, right? So maybe that's PFIC 1. If somebody else came and took the engine out but left the tires, well, guess what? The car's still not going to work, but there's a whole different reason why that car is not working, right? Because the engine's gone. And if somebody else came and cut the gas line. And so part of it is recognizing that, like a car, there's a lot of things that go into making a car drive well, right? And get you from your house to Trey's house. But there's a lot of different reasons why that car may not be able to get you to Trey's house. And so depending on which part of the car is defective, that's where we label the different PFICs. So they're all trying to do the same thing, but they all have to work together to do it correctly. And just taking away one piece sometimes can lead to a lot of trouble. And so that's where the different PFIC numbers come in.
So you're saying like different stuff causes each PFIC.
That's exactly right. There's a different, unique problem that causes each PFIC, even though at the end of the day, sometimes what you see in a patient is very similar, right? So again, going back to the car, story, at the end of the day, the car can't drive, but sometimes there's a lot of different reasons why that car isn't driving, and it's based on, again, in PFIC, it's based on very specific proteins whose job it is to perform a certain function to get that bile out safely.
And I just actually thought of another question I was going to ask. So when Trey said, like, can itching affect after the transplant? Why is that only with PFIC 2?
Yeah. So again, this is like, and I'll take a step back and say, like, it's really rare, right? I mean, like, we would not do transplants and expect your itch to come back. But every now and then, PFIC 2 is special in that, we talked about how your body, the immune system of your body sometimes can recognize things that aren't your own, right, and attack that. There is a very unique problem in PFIC 2 where the body will recognize that one protein whose job it is to get the bile salts out, and will attack just that one protein, like just that. It won't attack anything else about your new liver, just that one protein. And so, let's like go back to our car analogy here, right? So let's say that PFIC 2 was a problem with the tires, right? And that for whatever reason the tires just like kept getting flat over and over and over again, right? Well, we're going to put new tires on, and so now you got new tires, and they seem to be working okay, but now all of a sudden the tires are getting flat again. So it's kind of like the same problem recurs, but it's in a new liver, and it's a complication of your immune system, but it's one that's kind of unique to PFIC 2. the good news is now that we know that that's a possibility. I think early on, it kind of stumped us when it happened, but now that we know that it's a real possibility, we watch for it. And if we're seeing signs of it, we have treatments we can give that stop it. So it's becoming even less of a problem now because we're able to prevent it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What a really good question, Cedar. And Dr. Schwer, I really love your illustration with the car. I think that is probably the easiest way I've ever heard it broken down why, how all of these different kinds of PFIC are related yet different. So, because this session is mostly for school age children, we want to ask a question related to school. So some of our participants, they are in school, some are homeschooled. So we have a couple of different questions about school. So if you had to pick maybe two things, what do you think are the two most important things that PFIC kids and their families can communicate to their schools about their disease?
Man, that is a great question. And again, part of it depends on, the individual kid and the symptoms they're having, right? So for somebody, maybe the most important thing is that, my liver disease, has that sometimes, maybe my eyes can be a little bit yellow, or maybe my belly can look a little bit big, or maybe I get tired easily than other kids, or maybe, again, I have a lot of itching, and so sometimes I'll have some scratches on my arms, and I need to take a medicine or do creams. And so I think that it's a kind of a very individualized patient question, right? But I think at the end of the day, one of the things that I would try to stress most is that, you can tell people that you have a sick liver, but that it doesn't define you, right? That's not going to be who you are. It's just part of you. But that sometimes you need to take medicines, and sometimes you need to have a little bit of a slower day. But that that hopefully the liver disease isn't going to be what people know you for. They'll know you for your incredible personality, or your funny jokes, or your skills on the basketball court, right? Or your math ability. I was never known for my math ability. Nobody ever knew me for my math ability. And so that's what I would kind of, that's what I would try to focus on, is that, if you need from a medical standpoint, from a doctor standpoint, a little bit more time to take a test, or a reason maybe to not necessarily, participate in some of the physical activity stuff, that you need, then we can do that. But that there's other things that are going to be better to define you than a sick liver.
Cool, thank you. And so another question for our up and coming PFIC kiddos like Cedar and Trey, who have a lot to say about PFIC, and some of our participants that are on the line here. I know Cadence is here, and they're all very interested in learning more about this disease and then taking action. So for those kiddos that are interested in the medical field, can you tell us a little bit about how you became a doctor working with PFIC, or maybe some things that they need to remember when they're in school? Because you said you weren't really great at math. So how did you, what classes are the most important, or what can they think about if they want to, be a PFIC doctor like you are?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess what I would say there is, there are a million different paths to being whatever you want to be. And I have friends that are doctors that studied English, and I am married to a doctor who studied economics and Spanish. And I have friends that are engineers that studied biology. And so, I've always found that if you ask somebody, why do you do what you do? Why, what is it that made you want to do that? Generally, what they point to is somebody along the way in their life who they looked at and said, that's awesome. I kind of want to do that, but to get there, you need to kind of do the things that interest you. Because, if you really, really, really dislike, drawing, you're just like, you're not very good at it. It's hard, it's challenging, then you're not going to want to take those classes. But I think, I became a doctor because I knew some folks that were doctors that I thought, when they spoke like they really loved their job. It seemed really fun. They felt like they were always learning something, but I really don't, again, I don't think that's not unique to medicine at all. Right. I mean, I think really any profession that you'd want to do, and I would stress this by saying, as a PFIC patient, you can do whatever you want. There is no restriction on any sort of job that you'd ever want to have. But you got to kind of, keep your eyes open for those people that you come across in life that you kind of feel like are happy because they like what they do and like getting up and doing what they do, and recognizing that there's a lot of people who have very, very different jobs who have that same experience. If anybody ever wanted to learn more about, what it's like to be a doctor and go to med school and all that stuff, I'm happy to talk to you whenever and forever long. I do love my job. I think it's fascinating. And mostly I like, these kids, I think they're pretty awesome. They're pretty inspirational. But I think that, you can be impactful and you can be important and you can love what you do, whether you're a teacher or a nurse or a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer or an artist or any number of things. And they're all amazing jobs.
Thank you so much for taking the time to explain that and give our kiddos some inspiration.
Sure.
So as we get close to time here, I want to just ask any of our kiddos listening at home, if anybody has any additional questions, go ahead and put them in the chat or ask a parent to help you type it in the chat. Cedar, Trey, I know you guys have asked a lot. If you guys have any last burning questions, now's the time.
This is like stump the doctor time, right? It doesn't even have to be about PFIC. You can ask me about anything out there. Like, what's my favorite color? It's green. Green is my favorite color.
Green is your favorite color. What's your favorite? Do you like sports, Dr. Squires?
I do like sports. Yeah. No, Emily's not allowed to ask questions. No, this is not fair.
What's your favorite sport to watch, Dr. Squires?
My favorite sport used to be basketball, but I now have kids who really like soccer. And so I've gotten into watching soccer because my kids are into watching soccer. And I never watched soccer growing up, and I've learned a lot about it. It's pretty fascinating.
Oh, wow. We've got a lot of, we've got some sports fans. Trey is a big sports fan.
What do you like, Trey?
Football and baseball.
Football and baseball. Who's your football team?
Ravens.
Ravens? Come on, man. I'm in Pittsburgh. I can't. All right, well, we're going to mute Trey. Trey won't be able to talk anymore for the rest of the talk. Steve, what do you got? You got something?
Yes. So, what was my question? Oh, yeah. So, this might be a tricky question.
I'm ready.
How do they transport the bad liver and then put the new liver in and all that stuff?
How do they transport it? Well, I mean, so this is actually easy, right? It's like the same way you transport your soft drinks to a football game. You put it in a cooler on ice, and you just carry it with your cooler from one hospital to another. And it's as easy as that. So if you have a bag of ice and an igloo cooler, you could transport organs. Yeah, I know. You're telling me.
Wow.
I mean, we keep it cleaner, we do other things, but, It's not that, it's not that subspecialized. Just need a cold space and and a cooler, something to keep it cold.
Yeah, I have one more.
And what do you do with the old? What do you do with the old livers?
Well, this actually, this is so old PFIC livers we kind of throw out. They don't work for anybody. There's not a lot we can do with those. Sometimes we save a piece and then, we can have we bring patients down if they want to see the old livers, like, under a microscope or stuff. Sometimes patients allow us to do research on old livers, right? Again, there's a lot about PFIC we don't fully understand. So if we can take a piece of it and do a bunch of experiments on it to understand a little bit more about what PFIC is and what it does. There are some disorders, and this is where I can kind of geek out a little bit, so I apologize, where they may have a sick liver because they have one protein that's missing, but other people don't have that. That protein is not just in the liver, so we can actually take their livers and put it into somebody else, and that's called a domino transplant. So I'll take one liver from a donor, put it into a patient, the patient's liver, and put it into somebody else. That's kind of cool. That can happen.
That
too.
does sound cool. Go ahead, Cedar. You can help us end our session with the last question.
Okay, this is a question I've stuck with like a long time. What tools do they use to do the transplant?
What tools do they use to use a transplant? They have lots and lots and lots of really cool tools. Sometimes it's as simple as a scalpel, right? We all know about the knives, but today they don't really even use scalpels much anymore. It's called an argon beam. It's a laser beam. It is literally it's like a laser. It shoots a laser. So they use these laser beams. And then a lot of times it's kind of old-fashioned needle and thread. So they use, needles and they kind of sew stuff together, just like somebody would sew a ripped sleeve onto a shirt or something. So it's pretty, but they're working really, really tiny. So they got big glasses that they use so that they can see these little tiny spaces.
Wow, that's really cool to think about. All right.
Laser beams and needles.
A laser beam.
You.
Cool. Well, Dr. Squires, thank you so much for doing this presentation for our kiddos. We've got some comments in the chat that this was great and easy to understand. So thank you. There's definitely some nuggets here that we will take away, and it'll help us when we try to communicate to friends and family and other kiddos about PFIC. So thank you so much for your time. This was terrific.
Absolutely. Anytime, guys. Great seeing you. I think I'm on a panelist session tomorrow too with everybody else, all the other talkers. So I'm sure we'll see you there, except for Cedar's not allowed. Trey's definitely not allowed. No Ravens fans. We don't accept that.
Sorry.
Oh.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Squires, and to all of our participants.
Bye.
We'll close out this this webinar, and he's showing you his Raven shirt.
I got it.
We will see you guys back at the 2 o'clock session. That's going to be led by Cedar and Cadence and Trey. So don't miss out on a time for our kids to connect. So thank you again, and we will see you guys shortly.
Bye.
Bye.